Running in daylight, in silence, in plain clothes, Ariel Stanton, a black woman, still was cuffed like a criminal by a white cop who never listened and never saw her as anything but a threat. He only saw her skin. What he didn't know? She was the director of the FBI. That moment, caught on live stream, didn't just break the internet. It shattered a lie America tells itself, that a badge protects you from bias. How does a nation heal when the uniform becomes a weapon? Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments because racial injustice knows no borders. The morning air in Brookfield, Ohio, carried that crisp Midwestern stillness. White fences, trimmed to perfection. Hydrangeas blooming in obedient rows. Sidewalks scrubbed clean like the conscience of a neighborhood that refused to admit it had one. On the paper, Brookfield was the kind of place where nothing ever happened. But only if you fit the mold. Only if your skin said you belonged. Ariel Stanton's stride was steady, rhythmic. Her charcoal gray running tights hugged her lean frame, and the dry wick top she wore shimmered with sweat beneath the sun. Her breathing was measured, controlled. She kept her pace even as she rounded the corner of Alderidge Lane, where houses came with 4-car garages and mailboxes that didn't need locks. Her earbuds pulsed with the low thump of ambient jazz. No badge, no gun, no ID. That was the protocol. When you were the director of the FBI and knee-deep in a covert operation to dismantle a multi-state human trafficking ring, exposure wasn't an option. Not even in a neighborhood like this. Especially not here. Sergeant Dean Huxley was on his usual patrol, riding shotgun in his own kingdom. He sipped lukewarm coffee from a cracked thermos and cruised like a man who hadn't been challenged in 20 years. His voice crackled through the local dispatch frequency. Unit 3 Alpha, all quiet in Brookfield. The radio responded with a bored chuckle. Must be the perfect town. Dean smirked. If it ain't perfect, it's damn close. Then he saw her. A black woman, mid-40s, fit, focused, confidence, not looking at him. She ran past a silver Tesla parked in the driveway of one of the more expensive homes on Cider Hill Court. She didn't flinch, didn't nod, didn't slow, no eye contact. Dean's fingers tensed around the steering wheel. He tapped the brakes. The cruiser rolled to a stop beneath the shade of an old oak tree. The engine idled like a breath being held. Who is she? Why is she here? What's her game? His mind flooded with assumptions he wouldn't name out loud. She wasn't wearing anything suspicious. She looked like she belonged, and that, somehow, made it worse. Dean's eyes narrowed. His gut, the one he bragged about at barbecues and union meetings, told him something was off. Inside the cruiser, the silence stretched as he watched her get farther, still unaware, still running, until finally she slowed. Maybe she sensed it. Ariel had learned long ago how to feel eyes on her. She stopped at the edge of a driveway, one foot tapping against the curb. Her head turned slightly, just enough to scan behind her. The cruiser, idle, watching. She exhaled, wiped her forehead, and kept moving. Dean pulled out. Too smooth, he thought. Too confident. He hated how calm she was, hated how her body moved like she knew no one could touch her. You think you're safe here, don't you? At that moment, Dean wasn't thinking like a cop. He was thinking like a man who felt invisible power slipping just out of reach. A uniform used to command fear, a badge used to silence. And now, this woman, this stranger, was brushing past it all. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles whitening. His voice in the car was low, muttered, "Let's see what you're hiding." His turn signal blinked once, twice, then clicked off. He didn't need to signal. Not in his town. The decision had been made. Not based on evidence, not based on a call, not even based on behavior. Just a glance, just a jog, and the wrong color skin. And Ariel Stanton, director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, was about to be reminded that in America, even power can't outrun prejudice. The cruiser swung abruptly across the road, blocking part of the sidewalk as Ariel slowed to a cautious stop. The sharp scent of exhaust filled the air, slicing through the morning calm like a warning. She pulled out one earbud, the music now a dull murmur in her palm, and turned to face the officer stepping out of the car. Sergeant Dean Huxley adjusted his belt with exaggerated purpose. His sunglasses masked his eyes, but the way he squared his shoulders made the message unmistakable. You don't belong here. Prove otherwise. Ariel's pulse didn't spike. Training prevented that, but a thin knot of unease formed low in her gut. She had been here before, in different forms, in different towns. But today was different. Today she was undercover, exposed, and being pulled into a confrontation she couldn't afford. Dean cleared his throat. "Mornin'," he said flatly, not as a greeting but as an accusation. "Mornin'," Ariel replied, her voice neutral but calm. "Where are you coming from?" he asked, the words clipped and devoid of curiosity. She motioned down the sidewalk with a slight tilt of her chin. "Just out on a run. 2 blocks that way." Dean didn't nod, didn't smile. He took a half step forward, close enough for her to see the scuff on his badge. "Live around here?" "Yes," she answered simply. "ID on you." Her breath caught for a fraction of a second. This was it, the line. "I don't carry ID when I jog," she said, evenly. "It's not required." Dean raised an eyebrow. "It is when you're being questioned in an active investigation." Ariel's jaw tightened, but her tone didn't waver. "I didn't realize jogging through my own neighborhood qualified as suspicious." Dean smirked, and for a moment she could see the game taking shape in his mind. The telltale signs of a man who didn't like being questioned, especially not by someone who looked like her. "Got a silver Tesla on this block," he said. "Garage door cracked. Owner said someone's been lurking. You passed by that house a few minutes ago." "I passed dozens of houses," she answered. "It's a sidewalk." Dean stepped closer. "That Tesla's worth more than most people make in a year. You sure you weren't casing it?" It was laughable. If it wasn't so familiar, Ariel stared at him, measuring her words carefully. "Are you suggesting I committed a crime by running past a parked car?" "I'm suggesting," Dean said slowly, "that if you've got nothing to hide, you shouldn't mind showing ID." There it was, the old loop, the logical trap built to ensnare black bodies in polite neighborhoods. If you're innocent, why defend yourself? If you're clean, why speak with confidence? A few houses down, a man in khakis and a visor stood on his porch, pretending to check his mail. His eyes were fixed on Ariel. Beside him, a woman in a robe clutched her coffee mug tighter. Neither moved closer. Neither said a word. They see what's happening, Ariel thought, but they'll only remember what he says happened. She inhaled slowly through her nose, willing her heartbeat into rhythm. If she escalated, the story would write itself. Aggressive black woman, hostile tone, resisting. If she complied, she legitimized his suspicion, made it easier for him to do this to someone else next time. And if she revealed who she truly was, if she said, "I'm the director of the FBI," the operation she'd spent 18 months building would collapse in an instant. This was more than a stop. This was leverage, and he knew it. "I've done nothing wrong," she said clearly, "and I'm not required by law to produce identification when I'm not operating a vehicle or involved in a crime." Neither applies. Dean's eyes narrowed, and his hand hovered closer to his radio. She saw it before she heard the coded phrase, but it landed with the weight of a gavel. "Dispatch, this is Unit 3 Alpha. I've got a non-compliant individual, female, mid-40s, African-American, refusing to identify. Send backup. Code 12. Code 12. Suspicious person. Potential threat. Backup requested." Ariel's spine straightened. Her mind, sharpened by years of field work, began mapping out possibilities. Timing, angles, next moves. She couldn't run. She couldn't reveal. She could only endure. And wait. In the distance, she heard a faint siren chirp, probably a unit changing direction. Dean smiled for the first time. "Now," he said, "we're going to figure out who you really are." She didn't flinch. In her mind, she whispered to herself the words she couldn't yet say aloud. "You already have. You just don't know it yet." And, as the cruiser idled behind her and backup sped closer, Ariel began counting her breaths. Not because she was tired, but because she knew the most dangerous thing she could do next was speak. Ariel Stanton stood in the shade of a dogwood tree, sweat cooling across her temples, heart pounding not from the run, but from the calculus unfolding in her mind. Every move now mattered. Every syllable she chose. Every breath. Behind her, the cruiser still idled. In front of her, Sergeant Dean Huxley squared his shoulders like a man preparing to conquer, not to protect. She didn't move, didn't retreat, didn't raise her voice. She'd learned long ago that survival didn't always come from strength. Sometimes it came from precision. Dean's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask one more time. Show me your ID, or I'll place you under arrest for obstruction." Ariel inhaled slowly. "You are outside your authority." His jaw twitched. "I've committed no crime. You have no reasonable suspicion beyond the fact that I exist while black in a predominantly white neighborhood." Dean scoffed. "You're making this difficult for yourself." "No," she replied evenly. "You are. Title 42, Section 1983 of the U.S. Code. Violation of civil rights under color of law. That's what you're risking." For a brief moment, Dean blinked. He hadn't expected that. He was used to compliance. Fearful eyes, stammering apologies, shaky hands reaching into wallets. He wasn't used to legal references. He wasn't used to a calm, well-spoken black woman staring him down like she knew more than him, because she did. Across the street, the porch couple had multiplied. Another neighbor joined them, coffee in hand, arms crossed, eyes narrowed with curiosity and a touch of anticipation. Spectators. Silent jurors. The soft crunch of tires approached. Another patrol car pulled up beside the cruiser. From it stepped a young woman in uniform, hand resting gently near her radio, but not on her holster. She looked barely 30, her brown hair tied into a neat bun beneath her cap. Her nameplate read Cruz. Officer Isabel Cruz had been in Brookfield just under 2 months. She'd transferred from Albuquerque, chasing the promise of quiet shifts and low-call volume. But no training prepared her for the scene before her. A white sergeant with decades on the force bearing down on a solitary black woman with steel in her spine and no fear in her face. "Sergeant," Isabel greeted, her voice cautious, neutral. Dean barely glanced at her. "Just back me up." Isabel looked at Ariel, eyebrows tightening. Something in the air felt off, tense in a way she couldn't name. Her girlfriend, Asha, had warned her about this. Not if it would happen, but when. She thought she'd have time. She didn't expect this to be her moment. Dean noticed her pause. He turned sharply, stepping halfway between Ariel and Isabel. His voice dropped just for her. "You're new, so let me give you a word of advice. Stand down. Let me handle this." His stare wasn't just a warning, it was a dare. Isabel hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, sir." But she didn't move. She reached down, subtly, and flicked on her body cam. Just in case. Dean turned back to Ariel with renewed vigor. "This is your last chance." Ariel didn't blink. Her voice was silk-wrapped iron. "You're about to make a decision that can't be undone. I am not refusing to cooperate. I'm refusing to be harassed. I have a right to move freely. I have a right to exist. And I have a right not to be detained without cause." Dean's fists clenched at his sides. "You think your badge gives you power?" Ariel continued. "But power without law is just aggression." Dean stepped closer now, close enough that his shadow fell across her shoes. "Are you threatening me?" Ariel's eyes didn't flinch. Her tone didn't rise. She merely let the words land like falling bricks. "If you cuff me today, you will destroy your career, and you won't even see it coming." Silence followed. Isabel's breath caught. The neighbors leaned in. Even the birds seemed to pause. Dean's nostrils flared. In his mind, those words weren't caution, they were challenges. And he'd never back down from a challenge. Because Dean Huxley didn't just see a woman. He saw defiance. He saw audacity. He saw skin. And in the span of a single heartbeat, he decided what kind of man he'd be, based on the quiet, insidious reflex America still hadn't unlearned. And Ariel, knowing full well what came next, tightened her jaw, dropped her shoulders, and braced for the storm. There was no warning, no shift in protocol, no final attempt at reason, just a sudden, sharp movement. Dean Huxley lunged forward like he'd been waiting for an excuse, his fingers clamping around Ariel's wrist with a force that wasn't necessary, but entirely intentional. Her skin pressed into the cold steel of the handcuffs before she could even register the click. But she didn't flinch, didn't struggle, didn't give him the satisfaction of fear. Instead, she looked up, right into his eyes. Not panicking, not pleading, just seeing. And that, more than anything else, made his blood boil. Turning around, he barked, shoving her arm up toward her shoulder blade as he jerked the second cuff into place. The crowd of quiet neighbors across the street grew by one, then two. A teenage boy stood on the curb now, hoodie half-zipped, phone in hand. The red live icon blinked in the corner of his screen as he narrated softly, "They really cuffed her. She was just jogging, man." She didn't even raise her voice. Ariel heard him. She heard the disbelief in his tone, the sting of familiarity in his voice, and still she said nothing to him. Instead, she addressed Dean. Calm, precise, lethal. "You just made a mistake you won't be able to walk away from." Dean's lip curled. "Lady, you don't get to dictate how this goes. You think you're some kind of legal genius?" His grip tightened around her wrist as if the pressure could bend her into silence. "I don't care how many blogs you've read or how many protest videos you've liked. You don't run this stop. I do." She raised an eyebrow, just slightly. "It's not a stop if there's no cause." "Oh, you're one of those, citing laws, acting calm, thinking you're smarter than the badge." She let the words settle, then said softly, "I am." That was it, the final crack in whatever restraint Dean had left. His face darkened, not from fear, but from fury. A fury he couldn't name aloud, because to name it would mean admitting what it was, that her dignity, her confidence, her refusal to tremble had exposed something in him that lived deep beneath the uniform, something festering. "Should have known," he muttered under his breath, not quite whispering. "All that mouth, all that attitude. Typical. It wasn't loud, but it was loud enough. Officer Isabel Cruz heard it. Her body tensed like a wire pulled tight. From her vantage point near the second cruiser, she could see everything. The pressure Dean was applying, the unnatural angle of Ariel's arm, the biting language. Her chest tightened. Asha, her girlfriend, had once told her, "You may wear the same badge, but don't ever think they see you the same way." Isabel blinked hard and reached up. She pressed the small button just beneath her shoulder seam. A green light blinked once. Body cam on. She didn't step forward, yet, but she was recording now. She'd chosen. Meanwhile, the teenage boy's live stream gained traction. Comments rolled in at the bottom of his screen. "WTF did she do? This feels illegal. Tell her to say her name on camera. He's pressing her arm way too hard. He's gonna dislocate it." Dean, oblivious or uncaring, cinched the cuffs tighter. The metallic snap echoed like an accusation. Ariel winced, barely, but the red lines blooming on her wrists were unmistakable. "You know," Dean said, voice now low, condescending, "if you people just cooperated, this wouldn't happen so often." Her head turned slowly, definitely. "What exactly do you mean by you people, Sergeant?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to, because everyone heard it. The crowd, the camera, Isabel. The silence that followed wasn't quiet. It was damning. Still cuffed, Ariel stood taller than most people did free. Her voice was level, but it cut through the heat like glass. "You didn't cuff me because I was a threat. You cuffed me because I didn't bow. That's not policing. That's ego." Dean didn't respond. His fingers twitched, jaw locked. She added, softer this time, "And every second you leave these cuffs on me, you bury your own future." He pulled the cuffs even tighter. One last attempt to prove he still held power. And behind him, Isabel finally looked away. Her jaw clenched. Her finger tapped the record button again, just to be sure. because the moment had broken. The tension on Alderidge Lane hung in the air like thick summer humidity, oppressive, invisible, and impossible to ignore. Ariel stood still, wrists locked behind her back, her breathing steady but deep. The steel cuffs bit into her skin, but she refused to let pain replace dignity. She didn't need to speak. Her silence was louder than Dean Huxley's barked commands. The crowd that had formed on the sidewalks, cell phones out, mouths half open, held its collective breath, unsure if this was something to film or flee. Dean, meanwhile, was locked in his performance. His stance, his grip, the bark in his tone, it was all theater, and he was convinced he was still the one writing the script, until the man appeared. No flashing lights, no engine roar, just the quiet click of polished leather shoes on pavement and the steady rhythm of a man who did not hurry, but who also never arrived by accident. He walked out from the shade of a parked car, mid-50s, dark blue tailored suit, shirt crisp as glass, posture too precise to belong to anyone unimportant. A discreet earpiece, tucked just behind his right ear, shimmered in the sunlight, and the way he adjusted his cufflink as he approached said more than any badge could. Dean spotted him only when he was a few steps away, his brow furrowed, uncertain whether this was press, a bystander, or someone from internal affairs. The man moved with the kind of calm that made people nervous. "What's going on here, officer?" the man asked, his voice smooth, unhurried, commanding, without ever needing to raise it. Dean straightened, puffed up slightly, like a dog aware of being watched. "Just handling a situation, sir," he said, injecting a trace of faux confidence into his tone. This individual was acting suspiciously, refused to comply with a basic ID check, possible casing incident, still being assessed. The man raised an eyebrow, just enough to register disapproval, not enough to draw attention. He turned his head slightly, eyes now on Ariel. She met his gaze with the restraint of someone who'd had to memorize faces like his for years. But in this one, she saw no threat, just quiet recognition. "Ma'am," the man said gently, "are you all right?" Ariel didn't speak. She nodded, barely, and in that nod, conveyed what only trained minds could read. Yes, physically. No, not in any way that matters. But don't blow the cover. Not yet. Gerald Monroe had known that look. He'd served under 3 FBI directors, watched 2 fall, and only ever respected 1. And she was currently standing in cuffs on a sunlit sidewalk in a suburban neighborhood that thought it was safer than it truly was. Dean, now visibly irritated by the interruption, cleared his throat. "Sir, if you could please step back. This is an active situation." Gerald didn't blink. "Oh, I know exactly how active it is." He reached into the inner pocket of his blazer, not hurriedly, not with flourish. Slowly, carefully, like a man used to being watched. From the pocket, he pulled out a sleek black phone with no branding and a single button on the side. He held it to his ear. Dean squinted. "Who exactly are you?" Gerald raised a hand, dismissing the question like swatting away smoke. On the phone, he spoke only one sentence. Calm, crisp. "She's in custody. Activate Protocol 77. Dean's brow furrowed. What was that? Gerald ended the call, tucked the phone away, and looked back at Dean. This time his voice lost the politeness. "I'd suggest you uncuff her." Dean bristled. "You're not in command here. Neither are you," Gerald replied smoothly. "Not anymore." Behind them, Isabel Cruz shifted. Her body stiffened as she noticed the change in air pressure, like the temperature had dropped even though the sun was still baking the street. Something was happening. Something bigger than protocol, bigger than Brookfield. She glanced at Ariel again, suddenly wondering who she really was. A hush swept over the crowd, because even if they didn't understand what had just been said, they understood the tone. And they understood that power had entered the scene. Not the kind that blared sirens or barked commands, but the kind that made people change course with a whisper. Dean's hand lingered on his duty belt, but his grip had loosened. His instincts told him he was still in control, but the man in the suit had just made a call, and whatever Protocol 77 was, it had already begun. The sound came first. Not sirens, not squealing tires, but the low, unmistakable hum of a government-grade engine. Quiet, clean, predatory in its precision. Every head on the block turned toward the corner of Alderidge and Cider Hill as the matte black SUV rolled into view, its tinted windows blacker than regulation. It didn't signal. It didn't need to. Dean Huxley's hand instinctively hovered over his belt as the vehicle coasted to a halt beside his cruiser. His chest rose slightly, shoulders puffed, a subconscious attempt to reclaim whatever command he believed still belonged to him. But even he couldn't hide the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, because no one in Brookfield drove that kind of vehicle, and no one in Brookfield ever parked without asking. The back passenger door opened with a soft mechanical click. From it emerged a tall, clean-shaven man in his early 40s, dressed in plain gray slacks and a fitted navy windbreaker. No visible weapon, no badge, but the way he scanned the scene, sharp, unblinking, told everyone that he didn't need either. Another followed, a woman this time. Slim build, dark sunglasses, auburn hair pulled tight at the nape, no expression, no wasted movement. Her eyes locked instantly onto Ariel, still in cuffs, still standing tall. Dean stepped forward, his voice trying hard to stay firm, to reclaim territory. "This is a police investigation. I'm in command here. You're interfering with an active—" He didn't finish. The male agent cut him off mid-sentence with a question, directed not at him, but toward Gerald. "Is this her?" Gerald nodded once, sharp and slow. "Director Stanton." Dean blinked. The word echoed inside his head like a dropped hammer. Director? It didn't compute, not because he didn't understand it, but because his brain refused to accept what it meant. Officer Isabel Cruz, still standing by the second cruiser, had caught every word. She didn't move, didn't breathe, just stared as the truth settled in. The woman he cuffed, the woman he barked at like a criminal. She wasn't just someone. She was someone with more authority than anyone on this street had ever touched. One of the agents approached Ariel without hesitation, head dipped in deference. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" Ariel didn't speak. She shook her head once, expression unreadable. Dean took a step forward, voice rising now. "You need to back off. This is still my scene. This woman refused to show ID. She was acting suspiciously. I had grounds to detain her." Gerald's head turned slowly. "You detained the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation," he said, voice low and sharp, while she was mid-operation, and without cause. Dean's lips parted, but no words came out. His hand twitched near his sidearm, uncertain if he was reaching for clarity or control. "I said," he snapped again, louder this time, trying to reassert dominance, "I am the commanding officer on this scene." But this time, the response didn't come from an agent. It came from Gerald Monroe. He took a slow, deliberate step toward Dean. His voice was soft, barely louder than a whisper, but it cut through the heat like a cold wind. "And she," he said, "is the commanding officer of you." Silence. Not a silence of confusion, but one of revelation, of reckoning. A moment when every person watching, Isabel, the teenager still live-streaming, the porch onlookers now openly gaping, understood the depth of what had just been said. Dean stood frozen. The reality landed like bricks in his throat. He hadn't just cuffed a black woman jogging through a white neighborhood. He had cuffed the nation's top federal law enforcement officer in the broad daylight on camera, with nothing to justify it but his own reflexive bias. Ariel still hadn't spoken. She didn't need to, because power, the kind that didn't need to shout or swing, was standing silently at the center of the street, and it wore handcuffs. Dean's mouth opened to speak, to defend, to redirect the narrative, but the agents were already moving. One reached for his radio, the other opened the rear door of the SUV, and as Gerald turned away, his voice floated back like the toll of a bell. "Stand down, Sergeant. The consequences have already begun." A hush settled over Alderidge Lane, not the peaceful kind that usually marked Sunday mornings in Brookfield, but the thick, heavy silence that follows a tremor just before the fault line cracks open. Dean Huxley stood stiff, drenched in the heat of his own miscalculation. His hands hovered midair, fingers twitching with the memory of power that had just moments ago felt absolute. But now, something colder gripped his spine. The agent's arrival, the call Gerald Monroe had made, the unspoken hierarchy silently reshuffling around him, it all pointed to one terrifying truth he hadn't yet allowed himself to say aloud. And then, Ariel spoke. Still cuffed, still motionless, she turned her head, slow, precise, with the steadiness of someone who had never once been afraid of him. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't crack. It was cut. "My name," she said, "is Ariel Stanton. I am the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." She let the words sit, let them settle into the marrow of everyone within earshot. Then she added, calmly, as if delivering a procedural update, "And you just placed your superior officer in handcuffs, on camera, without cause, in the middle of a federal operation." The silence deepened. Dean didn't move. Couldn't. His skin went pale beneath the sunburn rising on his neck. The sweat soaking his uniform clung to him like shame. Behind his sunglasses, his eyes darted between Monroe, the agents, Ariel, and the crowd, searching for someone, anyone, who might still believe he had acted in good faith. But no one stepped forward. The boy with the phone kept filming. The neighbors stayed frozen on their porches. And Isabel Cruz? Isabel no longer looked confused. She looked done. Gerald Monroe didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Uncuff her," he said, immediately. Dean hesitated, only for a second. But in that hesitation, every layer of his authority peeled away. The agents didn't move. Monroe didn't repeat himself. And Ariel didn't flinch. The power had shifted. Dean finally stepped forward, trembling hands fumbling with the key. As the first cuff clicked loose, he avoided her gaze. But Ariel never looked away. Her eyes stayed locked on him, not with hatred, not with fear, but with a quiet, damning certainty. The second cuff snapped open. She rubbed her wrist slowly, the red indentations blooming like silent witnesses against her skin. Isabel stepped forward then, voice low but firm, almost shaken with the weight of what she was about to say. "This isn't over," she said, facing Dean now. "You're going to answer this. For all of it." Dean blinked, startled, not just by the words but by who said them. Cruz, the rookie, the silent one, the one who had stood behind him. "Not anymore. You didn't just detain the FBI director," she continued, louder now. "You detained her because she was black, because she didn't look like she belonged. And we all saw it. That badge doesn't cover that kind of mistake." No one spoke. Ariel didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. Isabel's words were a mirror, and Dean couldn't look away. He opened his mouth to defend himself, but nothing came out, because what defense could there be when the truth was branded into the very shape of the moment? The agents escorted Ariel to the SUV, not as if they were rescuing her, but as if they were accompanying a head of state. And, in many ways, they were. Isabel watched her go, the image of Ariel walking with cuffs freshly removed and posture perfectly straight burned into her mind. And as the SUV door clicked shut behind Director Ariel Stanton, Isabel realized something Dean hadn't yet fully understood. He hadn't just lost control of the situation. He had lost control of the story, and the whole country was about to watch him unravel inside it. The dust hadn't settled yet on Alderidge Lane, but the damage had already taken root, visible not in broken bones or shattered glass, but in the silence that wrapped around the street like a confession too heavy to carry. Dean Huxley stood motionless beside his cruiser, his authority leaking from him like air from a pinprick tire. The neighbors who once greeted him with polite nods and small talk now stared through him as if they were seeing something they'd always suspected, but had finally been forced to name. Meanwhile, across the sidewalk, Officer Isabel Cruz stood alone near the second patrol car, her face taut, her jaw clenched so tight she felt it buzz in her ears. Her body cam was still rolling, silently preserving every slur, every misstep, every ounce of unchecked power that had exploded in broad daylight. But it wasn't enough to record it. Not today. Not this time. She reached into the front pocket of her vest, retrieved her department-issued mobile tablet, and pulled up the footage. Her hands trembled, not with fear, but with purpose. As the video buffered, she saw it all again. The way Dean's tone shifted, the moment his authority turned to rage, and most of all, the way Ariel had stood there, cuffed, calm, and unbroken. Isabel tapped the forward icon. The recipient wasn't in her local precinct. She bypassed the regional command center, ignored the internal affairs routing system. Instead, she typed in a secure federal email address, one she'd been told never to use unless it was urgent. Oversight@fbi.gov. Subject line: requesting federal oversight. Urgent. Body. Attached: body cam footage. Officer Dean Huxley, Brookfield PD. Immediate review requested. This is not the first time, but it needs to be the last. Officer Isabel Cruz. She hit send, and for a moment she didn't breathe. The reply came back in less than 5 minutes. It was short, no signature, no header, just a single line. You're not the first person to send us a video on Huxley, but you'll be the last who has to. Isabel's thumb hovered over the message. She stared at the words until the screen dimmed, as if they were daring her to believe that change could actually begin with her. For the first time since she'd put on the uniform, she allowed herself to think that maybe the badge didn't have to mean silence. Back across the street, the SUV door shut with a clean hydraulic hiss. Ariel Stanton sat in the back seat, her wrists raw but her voice steady. The agent beside her turned slightly, speaking into a concealed mic. Director, en route to the safe zone. Brookfield PD has been neutralized. DOJ liaison en route within the hour. Ariel didn't respond right away. Her gaze locked on the side mirror. In it, she saw Dean standing beneath the sun, blinking like a man trying to remember what justified what he'd just done. He still didn't know, still hadn't realized that while he was performing dominance, someone else had been recording history. She leaned slightly forward, voice low but clear enough for both agents to hear. Don't let anyone mop up his mess, she said. They both turned toward her, nodding. She looked out the window again. Let America see it for what it is. Let them see him for what he is. Her eyes, lit not with vengeance but with fierce precision, narrowed. Outside, Dean still believed he could explain it away, that the report could be shaped, the narrative redirected. But inside that SUV, Ariel Stanton had already written the first line of his legacy, let them see the truth. And this time, the footage wouldn't disappear. By nightfall, Brookfield was no longer a quiet, nameless Ohio suburb. It was a symbol, a flashpoint, a stage where yet another scene of racial profiling had played out. But this time, the curtain didn't fall quietly. It burned. The teenager's live stream, raw, shaky, and unfiltered, had been picked up by Marcus Lang, a prominent black tech influencer with 3.7 million followers on social media. Known for calling out institutional racism in tech, Marcus rarely posted about law enforcement issues. But something about Ariel Stanton's quiet strength in the video, a woman cuffed without resistance, holding her dignity like a shield, cut through the noise. He added just one line above the clip. They didn't know they were cuffing the FBI director, but we did. It exploded. Within 10 hours, the video had crossed 5 million views. It landed on Instagram stories, news threads, Reddit front pages, and stitched social media where creators paused, rewound, and dissected the moment Dean Huxley grabbed Ariel's wrist like a warning. The screen froze on her face, calm, unreadable, devastatingly composed. People posted reactions with captions like, "She didn't even flinch. That's power. You see that look? That's the end of his career." He cuffed a director, not just of the FBI, of history. By 6:00 p.m., CNN cut into regular programming. The anchor's voice was solemn but loaded with barely veiled incredulity. A black woman was handcuffed while jogging through her neighborhood. But this time, she wasn't just another statistic. She was the director of the FBI. Clips from Ariel's body cam surfaced, courtesy of an anonymous source within the Bureau, likely Isabel, though no one confirmed it. The nation watched Dean Huxley's voice rise, his face twist, His hand tightened the cuffs, and in the middle of it all stood a woman who said almost nothing, because the truth no longer needed to shout. At a town hall in Atlanta, a group of black mothers sat in a circle, watching the news break live. One of them, Monique Lawson, a nurse who had buried her younger brother after a wrongful arrest in Georgia, quietly drafted an email on her phone. She wasn't sure Ariel would ever see it. She just needed to send it. To Ariel Stanton, FBI. Subject, my daughter, Director Stanton. Tonight my daughter saw your video. She's 13. She's always wanted to be in the FBI, but lately she's started to believe girls like her don't get that far. That maybe we're only meant to be on the other side of the badge. But tonight, she saw you, standing tall, silent but commanding everything. And she turned to me and whispered, "Maybe I still can. Thank you for not bowing your head, for showing her the fight doesn't always need fists. Sometimes it just needs presence." With gratitude, Monique Lawson, Atlanta, GA. Back in a D.C. safe house, Ariel sat in a dim room reading the email in silence. Outside, the world spun faster. News vans parked outside Brookfield PD, protesters holding signs that read, "She's your boss and you can't cuff power." The mayor issued a limp statement about increased oversight, while Dean Huxley had reportedly taken a leave of absence, though the DOJ had already scheduled interviews. Ariel didn't say much to her team. She didn't need to. Her words were already traveling faster than any press release could carry them. She closed the email, placed her tablet on the desk, and exhaled. Not in exhaustion, but in clarity. This wasn't just about her anymore. It never really had been, because somewhere in America tonight, a little black girl went to bed believing she could one day lead the FBI. And this time, belief didn't feel like fantasy. It felt like an inevitability. The auxiliary FBI command center outside D.C. wasn't built for press conferences or diplomacy. It was built for shadows, sealed corridors, keypad locks, and conference rooms with no windows. Inside one of those rooms now sat 9 of the Bureau's most trusted senior officials. Every one of them handpicked for the anti-human trafficking operation Ariel Stanton had spent the last 18 months assembling. The room was dim, save for the soft blue hue of a paused video on the main screen. The image froze on Ariel's face, her jaw steady, shoulders squared, wrists bound in stainless steel. No one spoke. A quiet tension stretched between the lines of suits and lanyards, between notepads and digital tablets, between silence and complicity. Ariel stood just inside the doorway, having entered without announcement, still in the same dark slacks she wore during her arrest, her blouse faintly creased. There was no visible bruise on her wrists, but the room didn't need visible proof to feel the violence. Gerald Monroe rose first, clearing his throat. He'd been by her side on the sidewalk. He had seen it all unfold. "Director Stanton, Ariel," he began cautiously. "We reviewed the footage again, start to finish. Dean's actions. There's no justification. You held your ground. You did nothing wrong." But Ariel didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the paused screen. Another senior officer, Deputy Director Claire Henley, leaned forward. Her voice was low and clipped. "What concerns us is the fallout. The video is still spreading. We're up to 11 million views across platforms. #jogging. While Black is trending globally, we're also receiving requests from congressional staffers asking if the FBI intends to file any complaint or federal lawsuit." She looked at Ariel then, but her expression wasn't pity. It was a strategy. A male analyst tapped his pen nervously on the armrest. "We need to make a decision soon. Either the Bureau takes the high road, publicly condemns the incident, or we manage it internally and move on with the trafficking operation. Exposure risks, compromising the agents embedded in Ohio and Kentucky. That was the elephant in the room. The operation. Ariel's mission. Exposing Dean Huxley might mean tipping off the very network they were trying to dismantle. A trafficking syndicate using suburban police channels as logistical cover. That was why Ariel hadn't identified herself. That was why she hadn't fought back. Gerald glanced around and took a breath. "If I may," he said, addressing the room but watching Ariel's face, we all saw what happened. The man cuffed his superior on a public street because he didn't recognize her, because she was black. And if we, the Bureau, decide to bury this, then what does that say about the badge we wear? Gerald, interjected Henley, we're not talking about burying anything. We're talking about prioritizing mission integrity. The network we're targeting has moved over 24 young women across state lines in the last 90 days. If they suspect we're watching. Ariel raised one hand. Calm, deliberate. It was the first time she had spoken. I understand the risk, she said. Her voice didn't shake. I built the operation. Her gaze swept across the table, landing on each person in turn, making it impossible to look away. But let me ask one question before we plan damage control, she continued. Was I cuffed because I forgot an ID? Or because I was black? No one answered. Not immediately. Even the room's HVAC system seemed to go silent. From the back corner, Agent Howard Baer, a veteran of 30 years with wiry, gray hair and a voice that usually grumbled out of habit, leaned forward. If this happened to you, he said softly, a director, in broad daylight, with civilians watching, body cams rolling, and a full task force behind you, then what the hell happens to the people with no camera, no title, and no backup? He shook his head, eyes misty. We train local departments. We say we stand for law and order. But maybe we're just a better-dressed version of the same silence. Another agent, younger, glanced down at her phone, her knuckles pale as she held back tears. Gerald cleared his throat again. Look, we can address this internally. Suspend Dean, release a statement, use the DOJ as the hammer, quiet, effective. But we don't burn the Bureau's reputation by making this into a public reckoning. Ariel stared at him. Her eyes didn't soften. We're not janitors, she said, voice now edged with steel. We don't sweep up messes. We expose rot. Claire Henley pursed her lips. So what do you want, Director? The room held its breath. Ariel stood. I don't want revenge. I don't want applause. I want the truth. I want a justice system that doesn't require a resume to survive a sidewalk. She walked to the front of the room and touched the screen. The image is unpaused. Dean's face twisted in mid-shout, his hands tightening the cuffs around her wrists. The room flinched as if it were happening live. We can't keep asking black Americans to believe in a justice system that doesn't believe in them, she said, turning. This isn't about me. This is about the next jogger who won't be a director, the next teen who won't have an SUV roll up with agents, the next girl who goes missing and gets no headline because her skin isn't photogenic enough for morning news. She paused. I'm not retaliating. I'm demanding a reckoning. And if we can't give the public that, then maybe we never deserved their trust to begin with. There was no rebuttal. The team knew it. Gerald knew it. Even Claire Henley, always the chess player, gave a small nod. Then we went public, she said. No, Ariel replied, firm. We go honest. And, as the meeting ended, no one applauded because justice didn't need claps. It needed consequences. The air inside the Brookfield Internal Affairs Division felt heavier than its square footage should allow. No clocks, no sunlight, just beige walls and institutional lighting that hummed above a steel table bolted to the floor. Detective Rachel Lynn, Internal Affairs, sat calmly across from Officer Dean Huxley. She was younger than him by 2 decades but looked twice as unshaken. A closed manila folder lay between them. Next to it, a tablet faced down. A digital recorder blinked red. Dean slumped in the plastic chair with the stiffness of a man trying to appear relaxed. His fingers tapped the table in a slow rhythm, the same rhythm he used when annoyed at his kids for talking back. Now, it felt like a metronome marking time before his world collapsed. He had been told this was a clarification interview. But the second he walked in and saw Rachel, not a sergeant from the department, not even someone from internal review, but a federal-assigned IA officer, he knew it wasn't going to be routine. Let's start simple, Rachel said, voice low but firm. Why did you detain Director Ariel Stanton? Dean scoffed. The word director caught in his throat like a splinter. I didn't know who she was. She was out of place, didn't ID herself. I had reasonable suspicion. She was stalling, avoiding the question, acting strange. Rachel didn't flinch. Strange how? Dean hesitated. She had an attitude, didn't follow instructions. Rachel flipped open the folder. The top page was a printed still from Dean's own body cam. Ariel Stanton. Expression calm, hands by her side. Her lips mid-sentence, eyes focused, no signs of aggression. Under the photo was the time code, 000239. This is 2 minutes and 39 seconds after you first addressed her, Rachel said, her eyes not leaving the image. Would you describe this as threatening posture? Dean opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Did she raise her voice? No. But did she make a sudden movement? No. Did she reach for a weapon? A bag? Anything that might suggest she posed a danger? No, Dean grunted. But that's not the point. She was provoking, testing. Rachel picked up the tablet. Without a word, she tapped the screen and played the clip. The sound filled the room. Dean's voice, brash, cutting. Ariel's responses, measured and lawful. The moment of arrest, his grip on her wrist, the metallic clink of handcuffs, her calm words, "You just made a mistake you won't recover from." The clip ended. Dean shifted in his seat. I thought she was just some smug jogger trying to play smart, he muttered, gaze lowering. Smug? Rachel repeated, because she asked which law required her to carry ID while jogging, or because she quoted the 1968 Terry v. Ohio ruling back to you? Dean said nothing. Rachel slid a new document forward. Its heading read, Pattern of Misconduct, Preliminary Review. Below it, 14 citizen complaints, 9 years. A bolded line read, None escalated to formal investigation. 14, Rachel repeated, all dismissed, but all with common threads, verbal escalation, disproportionate use of force, and most concerningly, 13 of the 14 involved Black or Latino civilians. Dean sat back in his chair, arms crossed. He didn't deny it. He didn't have to. The silence was an admission. Look, he finally said, voice rough, you people sit in rooms like this, watch your little videos and judge us. You ever had to stare someone down at 2 a.m. in a dark alley? You ever had to guess if a split second would get you killed? You weren't in an alley, Officer Huxley, Rachel replied. You were in a park, middle of the day, with a woman in jogging shoes and no bag. Dean's lips pressed into a thin line. Rachel leaned forward slightly, not aggressive, just present. How many times have you done this, Dean? No answer. How many times did someone not have a badge to protect them afterward? Still nothing. She closed the folder. Tell me this, she said, her tone softening, not with sympathy, but exhaustion. When you grabbed her wrist, what did you see? Dean's eyes flicked up, meeting hers. I thought she was just another arrogant liberal with a smartphone and an attitude. Rachel nodded slowly. And she turned out to be the FBI director. Dean's voice was low, almost inaudible. I thought she was just some nobody, playing smart. Rachel didn't blink. She's the only one in that park who wasn't pretending to have power. She actually had it. Silence. The kind of silence that doesn't offer comfort, just clarity. Rachel stood up and turned toward the door but paused. You're not being charged. Yet. The DOJ wants to complete their parallel investigation first. But I'll be honest with you, Officer Huxley. She looked back over her shoulder. It's not just the country that's watching now. It's your department, your partners, your kids. You made this about power. But now everyone's looking at who used it and who abused it. She opened the door and stepped out. 2 federal monitors walked in without speaking. Dean didn't move. As the door clicked shut behind Rachel, Dean finally exhaled. But it wasn't relief. It was the sound of a man realizing he no longer feared losing power. He feared being seen without it. The walls of the DOJ interview room were a muted gray, sterile, quiet, almost merciful in their neutrality. A single camera lens stared back from the far corner, and the red record light glowed like an unblinking eye. Isabel Cruz sat at the metal table, her badge tucked into the inner pocket of her blazer. Her fingers were intertwined so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. She didn't look at the camera. Not at first. She kept her eyes on the surface of the table where faint scratches told stories of others who'd sat here, hesitating, calculating, confessing. This was the first time in her 7 years as an officer that Isabel wasn't wearing her uniform for protection. This time, she came as herself. The DOJ investigator across from her, a black woman named Tanya Lyles, said nothing for a long moment. She simply nodded, an unspoken permission to begin, not for the record, but for Isabel's own freedom. Isabel drew in a breath so long and deep it seemed to pull in more than just air. It pulled in years of silence. It started with her pace, she said. That's what Dean said, that her pace was off. Tanya tilted her head slightly. Isabel continued. He didn't like that she didn't stop right away. He said, "These people think they're slick, always testing." I remember that line because it made me sick, but I laughed, just a little, because I didn't want to seem soft. Her voice cracked, but she forced herself forward. She didn't raise her voice, didn't run. She quoted case law. She knew her rights better than we did, and I think that made him angrier than anything. The room was still. The only sound was Isabel's breath and the camera's quiet hum. When he grabbed her arm, I thought she was going to yell, to fight, but she didn't. She just looked at him, calm, like she already knew what this was, like she'd lived through it before. Isabel's voice dipped lower. Her throat tightened. I knew it was wrong. I knew it before the cuffs even locked, but I froze, because I've seen what happens when you speak up. She looked up then. Her eyes, wet, determined, met the camera. Dean once pulled me aside. A year ago. I questioned him after a traffic stop where he yanked a guy out of the car without a warrant. The guy didn't even match the suspect description. I said something in front of the rookie, just asked if we had a PC. Dean smiled, put his hand on my shoulder, and whispered, "Ask again, and I'll have you writing parking tickets in Anchorage." I believed him. Tanya scribbled something down but didn't interrupt. Isabel wiped under one eye with the back of her hand. That day in the park, when she said he'd made a mistake he wouldn't recover from, I knew she wasn't just talking about him. She meant the whole system that protects men like him, and I didn't know it yet, but she was talking to me too. She paused. Her next words trembled. I'm an officer of the law, but I'm also a woman of color, and that day I saw myself in her eyes. Her calm wasn't fearlessness, it was exhaustion. The kind that builds when you've lived your whole life trying to make yourself smaller so you don't get hurt. Her shoulders began to shake. I thought wearing the badge would make me safe, that being one of them would protect me from what I saw growing up. But I was wrong. All it did was silence me. She looked again at Tanya. And I can't be silent anymore. There was a pause. Tanya nodded gently and reached out to stop the recording. The red light went dark. The silence that followed was different. Not suffocating, but sacred. Tanya closed the file and stood. We'll follow up, but you've done something today few have the courage to do. Isabel stood slowly, her legs unsure beneath her. At the door, she paused. Her hand touched the cold steel handle, but she didn't push it open. She stood still, like something inside her hadn't finished shifting yet. That's when Tanya stepped forward and took Isabel's hand. It was a small gesture. No ceremony, no cameras, just one woman reaching for another. You just saved a generation of female officers, she whispered, and maybe some of us who thought the system would never hear us. Isabel didn't respond. Her tears did. As the door opened and she stepped into the hallway, into a world where the headlines hadn't caught up yet, something had already changed. Not outside, but within. And for the first time in a long time, Isabel Cruz didn't feel like she was hiding behind a badge. She felt like she had finally earned it. By the time Isabel Cruz's testimony was logged into the DOJ archive, America had already caught fire. Not in flames, but in voices. What began as a spark, a silent woman in cuffs, her title whispered in disbelief, had now become an unstoppable blaze. Within hours, the media had a name: Dean Huxley. Within days, they had a pattern. The networks ran back-to-back coverage, each one spinning the same truth from a different angle. CNN dubbed it Brookfield's Breaking Point. MSNBC opened their primetime segment with how many black lives had to be buried in paperwork before the system blinked. Even the local station that had once run puff pieces on Huxley's dedicated service to the community flipped their tone overnight. Every channel seemed to uncover a new case, a new complaint, a buried tape, a sealed settlement. It was as though the country had been waiting for someone in power, real power, to get pulled into the same storm that so many had weathered alone. And now that it happened, no one was letting go. An old clip surfaced, grainy, dated, but unmistakable. Dean shoves a black teenager against a brick wall outside a gas station. The boy had no weapon, no aggression, only his mouth. The police report had stated loss of balance. The video, however, showed Dean's palm squarely in the boy's chest, a smirk on his face as the kid gasped for air. Then came the mothers. On a midday talk show, a black woman named Vanessa Greer held up a photograph of her son, Terrence, 14 when he was arrested by Dean for riding his bike without a headlight. "He was just trying to get home," she said, her voice even but breaking at the edges. "They held him for 36 hours. No phone call, no explanation. They said he was being difficult. You try being a black child in handcuffs and not be difficult." She didn't cry. She didn't need to. The studio audience was silent. Online, her words were clipped and shared thousands of times an hour. Each segment fueled the next. Local journalists uncovered case logs going back a decade. 14 complaints, all marked unsubstantiated, all filed by people of color. Dean had a history, and America was finally reading it. Even the department's defenders grew quiet. That Friday night, a panel discussion aired on national television. A moderator posed the question that had now gripped the country like a fever. What if she wasn't the FBI director? It hung in the air longer than it should have, because everyone knew the answer. She would have been just another black woman in cuffs, another name folded into a spreadsheet, another victim whose dignity got labeled attitude. The panel grew heated. A former police union rep tried to shift blame to protocols. A civil rights attorney fired back, "If your protocols only recognize authority when it's wearing a white face, then they're not protocols. They're prejudiced." That clip alone racked up over 10 million views. Then came the hashtag. It started with a tweet from a college student in Atlanta. "When I was 17, I was thrown to the ground for asking why I was being searched. No badge, no title, just brown skin. What if she was me?" By midnight, it was trending in 48 states. By the weekend, it had become a movement. Black fathers tweeted about traffic stops that left their kids shaken. Latina mothers shared photos of bruises from officers who mistook fear for resistance. Asian Americans wrote about being told to go back to your country while reporting crimes. What if she was me wasn't just about Ariel Stanton anymore. It was a mirror held up to America, and it didn't flinch. Ariel herself stayed quiet. No interviews, no statements. But the silence wasn't emptiness, it was intentional. The nation didn't need her to speak. Her restraint was the message. And the DOJ? They were listening. One of the president's senior advisors was photographed walking into the West Wing, clutching a printed Twitter thread, highlighted in 3 different colors. Ariel's face was on the cover of Time magazine. The headline, "Authority Meets Identity." In Brookfield, the streets were quieter, but not calm. Protest signs leaned against fences. Sidewalk chalk quotes from Maya Angelou and James Baldwin bled into the concrete. A mural of Ariel began to take shape near the park where she was arrested, her image surrounded by the names of black women who never got to speak. And in one middle school classroom in Baltimore, a student stood up during social studies and said, "My mom says the FBI director's a black woman, so I drew her on my binder, 'cause maybe I can be one too. The teacher didn't correct her, didn't water it down, just nodded and added Ariel Stanton's name to the day's lesson board. Something was shifting, and the man at the center of it all, Dean Huxley, was nowhere to be found. He wasn't tweeting. He wasn't patrolling. He wasn't even denying, because the nation was speaking louder than he ever had. And when the storm finally reached his doorstep, it wasn't with fists or fire. It came with facts, with names, with stories that had waited too long to be told. It came with a question that refused to die. What if she wasn't the FBI director? What if she was me? The room was austere. No banners, no flags waving for applause, no music cues to stir emotion. Just cold lighting, folded documents, and the quiet rustle of federal power convened in one place. The Federal Conference on Law Enforcement Reform had drawn cabinet members, state representatives, federal judges, and police chiefs from across the nation. But the silence in the chamber was not out of reverence for the setting. It was for the woman about to speak. Ariel Stanton stepped to the podium in a navy blue suit. No badge, no title tag, no makeup to soften her expression. Only the soft flash of the FBI pin on her lapel and the weight of a nation staring back through every camera lens trained on her. It was her first public appearance since the arrest, and the moment millions had been waiting for. She did not open with pleasantries. No thank you for being here. No honor to speak. Instead, she stood still. Then she placed her palms flat on the podium, and after a long breath, she began. 3 weeks ago, I was handcuffed in broad daylight, not because I posed a threat, not because I broke a law. I was jogging, alone, no ID, no sudden movements, just a black woman on a sidewalk. The air in the chamber tightened. I am the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I have led covert operations across multiple continents. I have briefed presidents. I have held the lives of hostages in the balance of my words. But that day, none of it mattered. My degrees, my clearance level, my loyalty, none of it. All they saw was skin. She paused. Not for effect, but because the next words were heavy, and when they reached for the cuffs, I didn't panic. I didn't plead, because part of me wasn't even shocked. That's what hit hardest. Not the zip of metal, not the pavement pressing against my knees. It was the familiarity of it. I had seen it too many times, read too many case files, watched too many mothers cry. The screen split on cable news. Her image on the left, the words, "Live, FBI Director speaks out" on the right. But the room she stood in was still, as though afraid to interrupt. At that moment, I was not a federal official. I was not a symbol. I was not even a citizen presumed innocent. I was a silhouette, a target painted by centuries of training that told certain men, "This body is dangerous." One senator shifted uncomfortably in his chair. A U.S. Marshal in the back clenched his jaw. Ariel looked straight ahead, her eyes not searching for approval, but daring the silence to hold her gaze. I will not name the officer who arrested me, not today, because this is bigger than him. This is about a system that taught him to act without question, a uniform that too often confuses authority with immunity, and a culture that believes power flows only in one direction, downward. Cameras clicked, not for drama, but because the country needed every frame. I want to be clear. I do not hate law enforcement. I lead law enforcement. I believe in accountability because I believe in what this uniform should mean. But belief without reform is just hope dressed in denial. She glanced at the congressional panel seated to her left, then back to the camera. That is why I stand before you to ask, not suggest, not recommend, but ask with the full force of my office, that Congress move to pass federal legislation that restricts discretionary detainment without probable cause, that we limit unchecked stop-and-search authority, that we fund oversight bodies not as punishment, but as proof we value truth over tradition. A murmur passed through the room. She let it sit. This is not about protecting me. I survived. I have resources. I have reached. This is about the girl in St. Louis stopped for walking home too slow. The boy in Cleveland frisked for fitting a description no one can describe. The pregnant woman in Alabama who was arrested for resisting arrest when she was never told what she was being arrested for. Her voice, until now composed, finally cracked, but not in weakness. It cracked with control, with truth too large to package neatly. We are long past the moment for gentle review. We need recalibration. We need to acknowledge what this country still does with black pain, ignore it until it goes viral, then package it as a one-time mistake. Now, the room was no longer silent. It was listening. Ariel's tone lowered, not in volume, but in sharpness. I didn't cry in that moment. I didn't scream, but I saw something that will never leave me. The look on a young black girl's face across the street. She clutched her mother's leg when she saw me in cuffs, not because she knew who I was, but because she didn't. A single sentence followed, soft but brutal. To her, that was normal. And then came the line that would headline every broadcast, every article, every high school essay written that year. I am the director of the FBI, and I was seen as a threat, not because of my actions, but because of my existence. She let the silence return, and this time it bowed to her. A member of the press, seated beside the stage, wept quietly into a notepad. A junior officer from Detroit removed his cap and placed it on the table beside him. No one applauded. Not yet. The weight was too present. Then Ariel straightened her posture, pulled a folded document from her blazer, and raised it. This is draft legislation. It has bipartisan backing. It's been on someone's desk for 8 months. I'm asking you to pick it up, read it, and vote like your children might be the ones walking home next time. She didn't plead. She didn't perform. She simply laid the truth down like evidence, irrefutable and bare. Then, just before she stepped away from the microphone, Ariel looked directly into the camera, into America, and delivered the final blow. I wasn't handcuffed because I was wrong. I was handcuffed because someone believed they could never be held accountable. And then she walked away. No applause, just the low rippling murmur of reckoning. In homes across the country, daughters looked to their mothers. Sons asked questions fathers couldn't answer. And somewhere, a little girl who once watched her hero be treated like a criminal now knew that hero was the one shaping the law. The morning sun did not rise gently over Brookfield Police Department. It glared, sharp and unforgiving, on the concrete steps of a building now under siege, not by protesters or media vans, but by consequence. The blue trim of the precinct, once proudly painted with phrases like honor through service, now flaked under the weight of what it had chosen to ignore. Inside, in a conference room devoid of ceremony, Dean Huxley sat across from 2 internal affairs officers and a senior official from the DOJ. The silence wasn't the kind that waits for truth. It was the kind that settles after it's been exposed. A thick, manila folder sat in front of him, stamped with the DOJ seal. One official leaned forward and spoke plainly. As of today, you are suspended without pay, pending final disciplinary review. Dean said nothing. He had already run out of deflection, out of procedural excuses, out of smirks and scoffs. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, he looked stripped, not of his badge, but of the illusion that it could save him. Outside the room, the halls of the precinct felt heavier. Officers whispered, some in disbelief, others in reluctant relief. For years, Dean had been the shadow that walked ahead of accountability, untouchable, protected by silence, by rank, by habit. That had ended. The news broke mid-morning. Brookfield PD suspends Captain Dean Huxley indefinitely. Within the hour, another headline struck harder. Police Chief Donovan resigns amid DOJ probe into misconduct, cover-ups. Donovan's resignation wasn't accompanied by a speech or even a camera flash. He submitted a single-page letter, walked to the back exit, and vanished before local press could find his car. The city's top officer, who for years had stamped inconclusive on every complaint against Huxley, now found himself unable to sign his own legacy. The DOJ, led by Attorney General Ethan Langford, wasted no time. A formal press release announced a full-scale investigation into the Brookfield Police Department's internal complaint system, arrest records, racial profiling metrics, and disciplinary procedures from the past 15 years. The word used wasn't review, it was an audit. As news helicopters hovered, one thing became clear: this wasn't a scandal. It was a reckoning. Across town, former victims of Huxley began stepping forward. The floodgates had opened. A grocery clerk named Malik Foster filed a civil rights suit, citing a 2016 stop where Huxley detained him for matching a vague description, then left him on the sidewalk, bruised and without explanation. A high school teacher named Cynthia Rhodes told a local news anchor about a roadside encounter that ended with her license being thrown in a puddle and her dignity trampled. He said I was too loud. I had just asked if I could call my husband. By noon, 7 lawsuits had been filed. By dusk, that number tripled. But amid the roar of exposure, one voice remained steady: Ariel Stanton. She stood behind no podium this time, just a quiet DOJ hallway, flanked by investigators and legal aides. A journalist asked her if she intended to press personal charges against Dean Huxley. Her answer was clear: I'm not here to settle scores. I'm here to prevent them from piling up. She paused, letting that sink in. What happened to me was not a unique event. It was a uniquely visible one. My story only matters because it exposed the stories we've ignored for far too long. I will not participate in his prosecution. Instead, I've submitted a formal proposal for a federally mandated oversight board, independent of local jurisdictions, to investigate misconduct allegations in real time. We need more than justice. We need prevention. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about velocity, changing the pace at which justice moved from reactive to proactive. Her proposal, titled the Stanton Protocol, called for immediate triage response teams dispatched to any department facing more than 5 civil complaints within a 12-month period. It required body cam footage to be submitted to an encrypted federal archive within 24 hours, and it gave whistleblowers immunity and legal support. The memo had already reached the desks of 3 Senate committee chairs. That afternoon, as Ariel stepped out of the Brookfield DOJ field office for the final time, a small crowd had gathered, not with picket signs, but with notebooks, phones, and quiet reverence. Among them was a little girl, no older than 10, with thick braids and a purple hoodie that read "Dream Loud." She stepped forward shyly, clutching a folded paper in both hands. Ariel knelt down instinctively. The girl handed it to her, a hand-drawn sketch. It showed a tall black woman in a suit standing between 2 buildings labeled Justice and Truth. Below it, in uneven handwriting, were the words, "You're the reason I believe justice is real." Ariel's throat tightened. She smiled, not for the cameras, not for press clippings, but for the one person who mattered most in that moment. A child who had seen the country's darkest instinct and, somehow, still chose to believe in its better self. She whispered, "Keep believing, because that's how we build it." As the sun set behind them, Dean Huxley sat alone in a precinct that no longer claimed him. His badge remained locked in a drawer. His silence, no longer powerful, no longer protected, and Ariel, she had just begged. The night had gone quiet, not with peace, but with exhaustion, the kind of silence that comes after storms, when debris still clings to the air and the wind is too ashamed to return. In a modest apartment tucked into a nondescript building on the outskirts of Brookfield, Dean Huxley sat slumped on a couch that hadn't been used for comfort in years. His badge, polished to the point of vanity just weeks ago, now sat face down on the table, as if it too was ashamed to meet the room's only occupant. The TV flickered, sound muted, airing yet another primetime special titled The Fall of Captain Dean Huxley, Power, Race, and Reckoning. His name scrolled across the chyron, but he didn't look up. He didn't need to. He had heard his own disgrace spoken 1,000 ways by now, each one heavier than the last. His phone buzzed, just once. He stared at it for a long time, the glow of the screen casting pale light over his unshaven face. The subject line of the anonymous email read simply, "You said I was aggressive." He opened it. "I was 17. You cuffed me outside my aunt's shop. You said I was aggressive because I asked why I was being searched. You let me sit in Holden for 22 hours. I lost my scholarship. I dropped out. I got tired of fighting to prove I was worth more than your assumption. You don't know me, but I remember you. Every day." Dean didn't blink. He scrolled back up, read it again, then again. The cursor hovered in his reply box for what felt like an hour. Slowly, deliberately, he began typing. "I'm sorry. I was wrong. I let fear wear the uniform instead of discipline. And I never thought about who I was breaking when I wanted to feel in control." He stared at the words. Then, in a motion that seemed more reflex than reflection, he selected them all and pressed delete. The screen returned to blank, just like his future. He leaned back slowly, the creak of the old leather couch slicing through the quiet like a confession. Outside, the wind tugged at brittle leaves, tapping them against the window pane, each tapping a whisper he didn't want to hear. Dean Huxley wasn't a man accustomed to silence. For years, he'd filled rooms with commands, with authority, with a presence that demanded obedience. Now, all that remained was the hollow ache of being irrelevant. The email still sat open, its words glowing faintly in the darkness, as if daring him to read them a fourth time. "You said I was aggressive." That line hit harder than any headline, any protest chant, any cold stare from the officers who used to greet him with salutes, because it was the voice he could never silence, the one that never made it to the complaint box, the one that stayed locked in someone else's trauma until now. His fingers, once steady on a firearm, twitched slightly on the edge of the phone, a tremor he never noticed before. Maybe it had always been there, buried beneath decades of rationalization, armored by policies and internal reports stamped cleared. He looked around the room. The photos on the wall, commendations, plaques, a framed quote from his academy graduation, felt grotesque now. They were trophies in a house built on unspoken wreckage. People had thanked him once, called him a protector, a man of law. But what did that law look like through the eyes of a 17-year-old kid left in a cell for no reason other than being black, scared, and unapologetic? Dean rubbed his eyes, but it did nothing to clear the fog. The memories were there now, unwelcome and unblinking. That boy outside the shop, the look in his eyes. It wasn't fear. It was something else, something Dean had written off for years as defiance. But now he recognized it. It was dignity, and Dean had stripped it away like it was nothing. Routine, procedure. He thought of all the moments he never remembered, how many wrists he'd clamped in cuffs without listening, how many mothers he'd told to calm down while their sons sat bruised and bleeding in the back seat. Each one came back not as a list, but as a weight, a dull, suffocating pressure in his chest. This wasn't guilt. This was exposure. And still, he couldn't hit send. Because to send that apology meant admitting he had seen those people, that he had known. And if he had known, then the silence wasn't ignorance. It was a choice. His jaw clenched, not from anger, but from something deeper, something rotten beneath years of denial, shame, the real kind, not the performative kind you wear for cameras or courtrooms. This one had no audience, just a man, a screen, and a sentence he was too afraid to keep. He set the phone down, screen facing the table, as if turning it away could erase what had already been burned into his memory. But the words remained, echoing louder in the dark. "You don't know me, but I remember you every day." He thought about that young man's life, what it could have been, what it wasn't because of a choice Dean made in 10 seconds, backed by a system that never asked questions. And for the first time in his career, Dean couldn't explain it away. Not to a lawyer, not to a camera, not even to himself. He closed his eyes. But the silence didn't comfort him this time. It was accused. Down in Washington, the lights of the Capitol shimmered through the broad glass windows of Ariel Stanton's office. The hour was late, but she remained at her desk, upright, composed, her eyes fixed not on paperwork, but the city beyond it. Each glowing building out there had either failed her or finally begun to listen, and she wasn't done with either. A knock. Gerald Monroe stepped in, jacket slung over one shoulder. His expression was careful. A man who had seen her fracture, rebuild, and now lead. "Do you ever plan to sleep?" he asked gently. Ariel didn't turn around. "Sleep doesn't change policy," she said. He smiled faintly, nodding once before asking, "You tired?" Her response came without pause. "No," she said flatly. "I'm not tired. I'm angry, and I've still got work to do." Gerald lingered a second longer, then placed a thin file folder on her desk before heading for the door. He didn't need to say more. Alone again, Ariel turned to the file. National Task Force for Policing Equity. She opened it, leafing through the proposals, drafted legislation, and names. Names of survivors, whistleblowers, former officers, and policy experts, all ready to join a movement that had started with a sidewalk and a pair of cuffs. Beside the file sat a framed photo, one she had placed herself that morning. It showed 7 black women in uniform, shoulder to shoulder, representing different generations of the FBI. Some had retired decades ago, others were still in service. All of them had endured things the Bureau never logged and no badge ever protected them from. Ariel let her fingers rest lightly on the edge of the photo frame, the cold glass grounding her more than the stack of legislative drafts ever could. Those women, those warriors, had walked into rooms that weren't built for them, spoken the truths no one wanted recorded, and stayed anyway. Not because the system deserved their loyalty, but because the next generation deserved a fighting chance. Tonight, she wasn't just thinking of them, she felt them beside her. In the weight of her breath, in the heat behind her ribs, her eyes returned to the file. Each name inside carried its own quiet war. Officers who had resigned in silence, women who had testified and been transferred, young cadets who were told they were too emotional to lead. This was more than policy. This was memory, stitched with fear, stitched with rage, but most of all, stitched with resolve. She leaned back slowly, her gaze lifting to the skyline beyond the glass. Washington glittered in bureaucratic stillness, but Ariel saw it differently now. Not a monument to power, but a canvas waiting to be rewritten. She knew what they were saying, on the news, in the corridors of power, even inside her own agency, that she had crossed a line, that she had made it personal. But how could she not? Her wrists still remembered the bite of the metal. Her lungs still knew the pressure of being flattened against a truth no one else wanted to see. And above all, her silence, had she chosen it, would have only multiplied the next arrest, the next name, the next forgotten girl left trembling on a sidewalk. She whispered to the room, to no one and everyone, "They won't erase us this time." Outside, America was still asking hard questions. Some still didn't believe the facts. Some only believed now because the victim was a director, and others, for the first time, saw themselves in her, not because of her power, but because of the silence she had shattered. And somewhere, in a small Midwestern town, a retired officer sat alone in a room thick with memory, typing apologies he would never send, listening to the sound of a country that no longer looked away. As the final voiceover rose, crisp and solemn, it carried the weight of everything Ariel had endured, not just for herself, but for those who never got a podium, never got an apology, never got a second chance. She was handcuffed not because she was dangerous, but because she was a free black woman who didn't flinch. And after that day, it wasn't Ariel Stanton who was restrained. It was America, trapped by its own truth, with nowhere left to hide. In a country where a badge too often outweighs accountability, Ariel Stanton stood as a reminder that silence is not the price of survival, and justice should never be the exception. What began as a humiliating act on a public sidewalk became a national reckoning, not just because she was the FBI director, but because she refused to let the system explain her pain away. Dean Huxley's fall was never the story's end. It was merely the first truth finally spoken aloud. The real legacy was in the ripple. The child who now dares to dream of wearing a badge, the survivor who finally felt seen, the officers who choose courage over complicity, and the country, still divided, still raw, forced to look at itself and ask, what if she wasn't the director? What if she was me? because that's the question that changes everything. Now, we ask you, what part of this story stayed with you most? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and why this story matters where you live. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let justice echo beyond the screen, and let it begin with us.